All right, welcome to the forum. Glad to have you here. We're excited to have Jared Wilson with us. Jared is the Director of Content Strategy here at Midwestern, and he's also the Managing Editor For the Church, leads the Pastoral Training Center at Liberty, is a prolific author, has been a pastor, church planner, has done all kinds of things. And so, man, we're glad to have you with us today. So let me pray for us and then ask Jared some questions and trust that we'll benefit from his wisdom and his experience. Let me pray. God, thank you for today. Thank you for the opportunity just to fellowship. Thank you for the food that we just ate. We're grateful for your provision, God, and so we thank you for the opportunity to be here, to listen, to learn. Pray that you'd be with Jared as he speaks about writing and the importance of writing. Pray that we would listen intently, God, and as a result of this, that we would be better writers for your honor and your glory. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, got a couple questions, I think, at the beginning to kind of hopefully to lay the foundation for some of the later questions. So first question is this: why is writing important for Christians, even if they aren't called to vocational writing, like to write exclusively? Why is writing important for Christians, for believers?
Yeah, just the daily discipline or regular practice. I think because like anything, to be able to articulate well, to communicate well, right? So just on the basic level of communicating the faith or articulating what you believe with others, but particularly for those who are in ministry, whether you're a preacher or a pastor, but if you're in leadership, discipleship, something like that, there's something about the act of writing, I think, that helps us to process what we think, and it's similar to just journaling, right? So it's a way to take every thought captive, I think, to sort of process how you're thinking through how to put words together to articulate it well, and it just makes you a better speaker, and I think a better leader if you're able to, communicate what you're trying to say in ways that don't sound improvised, right? I mean, some people, when they start talking, like right now, I don't know what I'm going to say. So you're talking, and they're obviously thinking of what they're trying to say while they're saying it. The words just start coming out. And you're like, maybe we'll find a thought in here somewhere. And so I think just the discipline of writing, whether you're doing, you're blogging or you're intentional about your social media, right? Social media is not just a way to express what you're feeling, but it's a way to kind of communicate thoughts that you're having, devotional or what have you. All those little disciplines, even if you're not trying to go into the field of writing, I think just help us be able to communicate with excellence and also make sure that what we say is, to the best of our ability, thoughtful, I think. Which, is a great way of adorning the gospel, yeah.
Yeah. So the second question is, how should Christian writers think differently about writing than someone who doesn't know Christ? And so like a specific Christian approach to writing, do you think there's a distinction between Christian writers, non-Christian writers? And if so, what is that?
I think so, and I think it depends on genres too, because I tend to think in terms of nonfiction and fiction, and I think most Christian leaders tend to think exclusively of nonfiction. So sometimes when I'm thinking of writing, because I began as a storyteller, I immediately start thinking of like narrative arc and symbolism and all sorts of things that aren't necessarily always entailed in nonfiction writing. But as a preacher, I have found that having been trained as a creative writer helps, because it's just more instinctual for me to think in terms of an arc. So even with a sermon, which is a nonfiction work, hopefully you're not making things up, but
it should be nonfiction,
hopefully,
right?
Yeah, preferably it's a nonfiction work as you're preaching. But I tend to think in terms of like a rise of action and then a resolution. So even just that arc in terms of sermon writing just comes somewhat instinctual in me, because I began thinking as a storyteller, and most of the early reading that I did was almost exclusively fiction reading. So just, I think my muscle memory in terms of writing, was trained that way. So I think if we distinguish those, right? So a nonfiction writer, certainly how a Christian nonfiction writer writes nonfiction will be different than an unbeliever, because you're dealing with propositional truths. You're dealing with declarations. You're dealing with facts, that sort of thing. So you're writing, if you're a Christian, you're writing from a Christian worldview. So that'll obviously inform how you process the data that's around you. If you're a fiction writer, it's a little different because, if you're following kind of the C.S. Lewis model where he thinks the best art has Christianity latent. In other words, it's not that it's not there, it's sort of undergirding how you're expressing yourself. But a work of fiction isn't necessarily Christian just because it explicitly shares the gospel or what have you. I'm in the process right now of pitching a novel to a publisher, and they one of the questions they asked me was about the gospel content. Is the gospel shared in the story? And I said, no, there's no gospel content in the story. They said, well, what makes it Christian? Because it's a Christian publisher. Yeah. And so I just was trying to connect how the story relates to real truths, biblical truths, and hope that the intelligent reader is able to either follow those clues or at least have their imagination stirred in that way. So as a nonfiction writer, you have different values, obviously, in a different worldview. And so, the biblical narrative is reflected in how you're expressing those things. As a fiction writer, I think it's really interesting because we have what a lot of people dissuade fiction writers from, which is that there would be a resolution, or what we used to call it, cheerful ending, right, to the story, that the good guys win and the bad guys lose, and that's seen as like lame and unrealistic today. And yet, if you're trying to write from a Christian worldview, you're understanding that to have the bad guys win in a closed-ended story is to communicate something, right? Almost nihilistically, to end on that down note. So I think the trick is not that to be realistic, the bad guys have to win. I think to be a Christian artist, to have the good guys win in a way that's artful and that rings true, and doesn't seem artificial or like propaganda or something like that. So it's a tricky tightrope these days, I think, for Christian artists, whether musicians or storytellers, because what dominates the market is propaganda, essentially. The space for artistry that leaves some things open-ended, or at least that hints at truth, isn't quite there, right? Christian movies, Christian fiction, all that sort of thing. And so it takes a really confident and, I think, experienced artist to tell a good Christian story in a way that doesn't read like, well, I just was trying to get some propositional truths across, and the story was a good medium to do that, which is kind of the essence of propaganda, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful, fiction versus nonfiction, the distinction there, and how to approach those things. And it's interesting to think about Christian writing and Christian fiction, and how does it classify as Christian if it's not explicitly gospel. But I think I hear you saying if there's those biblical themes, these gospel themes that maybe aren't overtly or explicitly stated in the novel, but that it's based on those things, it's still communicating Christian truth. Yeah, and I think even to the sense of realism, Christians should be the most realistic about the world as it is, because we know the truth of what God is doing with the world. So we don't have to be afraid of the unabashed reality of brokenness and sin and what have you. So I think we approach those things differently than the unbeliever, who may either exploit them or revel in them or be somewhat nihilistic about them. We can be as realistic as they are and yet have that undercurrent of hope that we know that this isn't the last word. And it's a battle that if you're trying to write for the quote-unquote Christian market, I'm wading back into it now, so I'm not sure if it's quite where it used to be. I think people are a little more open now. But 15 years or so ago, when I was trying to publish my first novel, I had an editor at a publishing company say that I couldn't have. So I have a good guy. He lives, but he gets his arm blown off in a firefight. And it's like you can't have the guy's arm blown off. And I was like, why? I was like, well, that's just gross. You can't do that. And it's like it's not gory. I'm not like blood is gushing. It's just it happens, right? But no, the good guys can't get hurt. Yeah. And all the bad guys have to, be defeated in a non-gory fashion, that sort of thing. And that's just not real. Anyone reading that would be like, this is not how it happens in real life. So I think to be Christian isn't to make sure it's real tidy and doesn't have the potential of offending anybody,
to be realistic, but to have really, the undergirding of hope there, that we know how the big story ends up. And so how can you kind of seed that in your narrative, I think.
Is there anybody that you think is in the Christian writing sphere that's doing that really well?
In terms of,
in terms of fiction.
Fiction.
Right, yeah.
Probably, I don't know. I mean, because I don't read widely within the Christian fiction market. There are Christian writers who are writing fiction that I tend to appreciate. Marilyn Robinson, for instance, and others. But in terms of, the literary market, I'm not aware of a whole lot that's out there. I just got burned enough times. You read enough, Christian fiction, hoping to find something with some kind of literary weight to it, and it doesn't mean it's not out there. But I came to believe that those who wrote that way wouldn't get published. When I was trying to break in, it was a lot of this is a Christian doctor and he's writing a medical thriller, or a Christian lawyer writing a legal thriller, and a Christian cop writing and it was like, well, where are the writers? It was just it was all very genre driven, which which sells really well. But what was depressing to me was you could go to Barnes and Noble and find genre fiction, but also literary fiction. But if you went to the Christian bookstore, you couldn't find literary fiction. It was only genre fiction, which told me that the Christian market's tastes were a lot duller than the general market's tastes.
Well, I'm assuming probably most of the people that are in here probably are not looking to write fiction.
Okay.
Many of them are, and they may be, but many of them are probably looking to do nonfiction. I know I asked several questions about fiction, but moving more towards nonfiction. If someone wanted to grow as a writer, nonfiction, whether that's a class paper, a blog, and they're just writing a book later on, where should they start? What should they do? Just kind of lay ground level floor. What should they do?
Yeah, the two ways to grow the most as a writer are really just to read a lot and to write a lot. I mean, there's classes you can take, workshops you can take, books on writing, peer evaluation groups, classes, all that sort of thing. But really, until you just get kind of the rhythm and the practice of it, just like anything. I mean, you don't get good at anything without doing it a lot. So you got to write a lot, and probably more even than you think. But I also think to read a lot and to read widely. So to read things even outside the kind of writing that you're wanting to do. Certainly, you want to read a lot in the genre that you're writing, whether it's devotionals or academic works, or just blog posts that kind of do pastoral reflections, or whatever it is. You want to read a lot within that, just so you kind of get the rhythms of how that particular genre works. But I think to write excellently, we have to kind of work multiple muscles in our brain. So to read voraciously, but to read even outside things that would kind of challenge, how you would express. And I would even say to read poetry and read good stories. I know you're trying to get away from fiction, but I'm going to talk back to read fiction because it's written in a different way, and it helps. It just works different muscles than the typical nonfiction things that especially students tend to read because you're required to read and what have you. But to read literary novels, read poetry, because it just helps you see how to put words together to create more imagistic writing, which is especially helpful, I think, with preaching. Those of you who teach, or those of you who are preaching, to be able to kind of articulate in a way that gives a sense of glory, which is what you're trying to help people see, the glory of Christ, so that you're not just talking about it, but you're kind of creating the image of it, right? C.S. Lewis said at some point that we have to write in such a way that we're not just saying the mountain was beautiful, but we're describing the mountain in such a way that the reader reads it and goes, that's beautiful. So I try to approach all of my writing that way, even if it's a blog post or a sermon. Instead of just saying, the glory of God's magnificent, well, you say that, but how do you describe the glory of God in such a way that the person hearing goes, that's magnificent? Maybe not, in their head, but in their heart, you're kind of confronting them with an image. And I think the best nonfiction writing does that. So the way you get there, I think, is to read more outside of that, things that have more image, driven prose in them, which tends to be fiction and poetry, because it just helps you, I think, express yourself even in nonfiction in a way that kind of adorns the truth that you're trying to communicate.
That's helpful. Do you have like a structured approach? Do you have like, okay, on Mondays I'll read this genre, or do you just kind of?
No, well, yeah, I tend to have 3 or 4 books going at the same time, and I try to kind of make sure that they're different. So I'm usually reading like a non-Christian, nonfiction book. I'm about to start a book about all the movies that Ronald and Nancy Reagan watched during the Reagan presidency. So it's a guy who watched movies with the Reagans. I thought, how cool is that? And every chapter is the experience of a different movie that they watched in the White House, and I'm real curious about that. Yeah. So I read that. Previously, it was like a total 180. I read "The Body Keeps the Score," which is about healing from trauma, from abuse, and things like that. It's by a psychiatrist who has these experiments in different ways that the body essentially becomes programmed by trauma, and then how to sort of heal and recover from that. So it's not like I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a counselor or anything, but it's just a subject I was really interested in. I saw the book recommended by a lot of people. So I just, I try to mix that up just to kind of get my brain going in different directions and learn some things. Usually have some sort of devotional nonfiction book. So I just finished Martin Luther's Table Talk and started David Brainerd's diary. And usually I read that if I have my lunch break in the office, I'll read that then. And I'm usually reading a novel, at least one at a time. Just finished Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. About to start Leif Inger's Peace Like a River. I don't know if anyone's read that, but came highly recommended, so I'm doing that. And I'm making my third way through at night before bed, Augustine's Confessions. It's an 1800s translation from Pusey, Edmund Pusey. And so it has a lot of the these and the thous in it. So it's just a little more, it's taking me a little longer than some of the more modern translations. But yeah, so I just try to like spread out the genres, and I don't have like a schedule, like I gotta read 10 pages in this every day, but it's just a bit at a time, kind of working through the buffet line until I finish one, and then I'll replace it with something and just keep going.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I think for us as we think about reading and what to read, where to read, is there a list somewhere maybe that somebody's posted that you think would be helpful? Do you have a list of books you'd recommend?
No, that would be a good idea, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think maybe in a couple of those.
I'm on Goodreads, so there's no definitive like here's my favorite books list or here's what you should read list, but you can see what I have read and that sort of thing. And then I did a thing on the blog a couple of years ago that was something like what every Christian family ought to have on their bookshelf, like a starter kind of what you should have, a Christian library at home. And Sword and Trowel did a display out of it for a while where they had all those books in one little spot. But there hasn't been anything that I should do that, sort of like what writers should.
Great.
Yeah.
I think it'd be great.
Duly noted.
I look forward to seeing it. What are some of the most, this will probably be a fun one for you to address. What are some of the most common mistakes that people make in their writing?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think the most common is trying to sound like somebody that you're not. And that comes across in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's a particular person. And, you notice it, I think we probably all notice it with certain young preachers who, you're like, well, he's been listening to a lot of Matt Chandler or whatever it is.
You've got the hand motions down.
That's right. Yeah. Everything, you turn it over, everything's going on. The hand motions. He's always stirring something. I don't know.
Stirring it up.
Doing this. And then he goes out with it. We make it, and then we send it out to whatever it is. So and I think some of that, it's not like intentional. I mean, obviously, there's an admiration for certain preachers, and you listen to them, and you just pick it up. You're not like sitting down going, how do I sound like Chandler? But it's just because you're always listening to it. It just comes out. I think the same is true. That's why we should read widely as well, because we end up becoming, in a sense, imitations of who we're constantly reading. I notice it a lot. I hope no one feels, well, I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but I hope, I'm about to be real specific, and it could hurt somebody's feelings, I suppose. Like Ann Voskamp has a particular way of writing which depending on your taste, you either really like that or you don't. And I notice a lot, not a lot, but it's pretty regular that I'll come across women writers in particular who sound like Ann Voskamp. And it's a little off-putting because you're like, well, that you know what they're doing. And you think, and it's not that I think you're a bad writer, it's why don't write like yourself? What can we learn from those people? And I think the same is true also I mean, not to be gender polarizing here, but for young men who like polemics, and you read it and you think, this is someone trying to sound like Doug Wilson, or someone who has a really particular kind of pundit voice and it's very sarcastic. So those particular voices are very magnetic because they're unique. They're also very popular. And when they speak to you, by just sort of taking that in constantly, you begin to kind of put it back out. So the most common mistake, I think, is trying to write like somebody else. And even if it's not a specific person, sometimes it's just what you imagine a good writer sounds like. So we get a lot of submissions through for the church, and there are so much reading. There's just every adjective is in. I mean, it's just overcooked. What editors call purple prose. It's just so overwrought. And it's not necessarily that it sounds like some popular writer, but it sounds like someone trying to write like they think a good writer sounds. And good writing is as much about economy of language as it is, language that's impressive, right? So one of the most impressive things is being able to write in a simple way, not simplistic, but in a simple way, and get your point across, even in an evocative way, without having to load in all kinds of words and what have you. I do this too. I'll throw myself under the bus. The hyphenated words. So if you're a Piper fan, you end up with all of the God-saturated, everything's got a hyphen in it, and that's very Piperian, And so I have to catch myself sometimes as I'm writing. I'm like, oh man, like Piper's coming out and what I'm doing right now. So I gotta take a break from Piper for a while, or I'll use up all the hyphens on my keyboard. Yeah.
So do you think, just kind of follow in that same train of thought, I guess probably better ask the question instead of answer the question. How do you think how do you think writers avoid imitating or sounding like someone else? Does that go back to reading widely and just writing to develop? How do you find your voice as a writer? Yeah,
so reading widely, obviously. But I also think writing a lot, because after a while, it's just hard to sustain, pretending. I don't believe anyone sits down thinking, I want to make people think I'm as good a writer as that person. It just happens because you're reading that person a lot. But as you write a lot, you begin to find your voice when you're doing that. And the same is true for those of you who preach as well. You just do it enough, it starts to feel unnatural, that you're always kind of arbitrarily or artificially trying to sound like something else or try to impress somebody. And eventually your real voice just comes out because it can't not. And you become more comfortable in your own skin and more confident in what you can say. And honestly, you're just learning more as time goes by. So now you have more tools that are yours, and your voice starts to come out a little bit more. So I think, again, reading a lot and writing a lot is really kind of how you break through there. And in fact, like writing a lot, because you're just not able to sustain trying to put another gloss to sound like somebody on there. Like when I first started writing, seriously trying to, to be seen, because C.S. Lewis was like all that. I was trying to sound like Lewis. Like, who is this guy trying to sound British? That's as I look back now, I'm thinking, what was I even thinking? Well, it was just I was reading a lot of Lewis, and I thought this is how you sound. Like, I was even writing and spelling words in the the English way, using the U, color, C-O-O-U-R, because that's how I thought it was spelled. Because that's just how I was. And I look back now and think, what I really needed was not somebody saying, stop reading C.S. Lewis. What I needed, and what I had, was people who would just say, keep writing. And after a while, your voice just kind of, I think, comes out of that shell that's there, yeah.
And I think that's helpful for people aspiring to write. It's discovering your voice and being you instead of trying to imitate someone else. So thank you. let's kind of turn the corner a little bit towards the ethics of writing. What are some issues in regards to the ethics of writing that you think we need to consider as Christians? These are ethical issues either to avoid, or things that as a writer you should do this. This is just the ethical way to approach this.
Yeah, I think probably the number one thing that I think comes to mind with ethics in writing is plagiarism, obviously. And we live in a really weird age, because used to, if you wanted to plagiarize somebody, it was like you had to jump some hurdles, right, to intentionally plagiarize. Now there's so much in terms of social media that gets kind of shared around, where it's easy to plagiarize without knowing it. And in fact, some of the more public examples that we've seen in ministry over the last several years, I'm convinced was not someone intentionally trying to pass off another's work as their own, but just sort of the second, third layer of whether it's assistants working on things, or just stuff that's like in the ether, right? So I was talking about this with a friend the other day, how in the gospel-centered movement, almost all lines, I mean, they go back a ways, right, to all the old dead guys we read, but the way we express things, a lot of these dots connect back to Tim Keller. And there's just things that are out there that everybody says, right? Like, the gospel is not the ABCs of the Christian life, it's the A to Z. Well, everybody says that. And I mean, everybody probably don't know that. But that's like a Tim Keller thing. He was like the first one to say that. And obviously he's standing on the shoulders of those who influenced him, Lloyd Jones and Sinclair Ferguson and what have you. But there's so many of these phrasings out there. And I remember the first time it happened to me, so like a year or two ago, there were, how Tim Challies does those quote graphics? Every day he's got like a graphic with a quote on it. One came out, and it was one of my lines attributed to somebody else on the thing. And I looked at it, and at first, like, I'm mad, because, like, somebody's getting credit for something that I wrote, right? Which is the first kind of, like, the self-righteous indignation kicks in. But the more I thought about it, and I talked to the guy just to, like, see, like, where did you get that quote? Well, he used it in a book and didn't know that I had like the phrasing is very specific, that it originated with me. It was just out there. And so the more I thought about it, I was like, man, it's like I've entered the arena where things I say are just out there now. It's just part of the vocabulary. And that's kind of cool, really.
People are plagiarizing
that's
you, man.
Right,
Hey.
But not intentionally, right? He wasn't like, I'm going to steal Jared's line. He didn't know it was a Jared line. It's just out there. And because of social media in particular, where things get copied. And I'll even see it where, like, I'll quote someone in a book. I've seen this happen, where I attribute, here's a quote from someone, and I attribute it to them. Or it's more common actually in a sermon. Such and such said, and you say the thing, well, people are tweeting what you're saying, or they're quoting you on social media, and they just attribute it to you. And I always feel bad, like, no, I didn't actually say that. I was quoting such and such. And it's just because of the multiple filters that this happens. So I just think as a writer, we need to be even more diligent now to track things down, especially if it's particular phrasing. If something's like a really unique phrase, and it just seems like it's out there in the ether, there's probably an origin to that. So, even just to get on Google or Google Books and put that in and see if, what's the earliest reference. So the gospel wakefulness thing. So I wrote this book called Gospel Wakefulness. Well, before it came out, I thought, I don't think I came up with that. The concept, I certainly didn't. But the phrasing, I was convinced, like I heard that from somebody. So I did as much research as I could to try to find what's the earliest record I can locate of someone using the phrase gospel wakefulness, and the earliest I could find was me. So I don't know, if I heard it from someone and it's not published or what have you. But because I couldn't find anybody, I just ran with it, and then no one's complained about it. But
you're the man.
But I try to do the diligence of like I think this probably was used by somebody else, and I want to be able, to note that. I just think plagiarism is probably the biggest ethical concern. So it's possible that we fall into it because of the nature of social media and the way information spreads today, that we fall into it unintentionally. So we have to redouble our efforts to kind of be really clear on those things. Yeah.
I didn't know if you thought not using the Oxford comma was a moral issue.
That's the moral issue of our day, Jared Bumpers, the Oxford comma.
Well, I think this is something that most people in here would want to hear you talk about a little bit. you obviously you write a ton of content.
Yeah,
right here, your collected writings. And so walk us through your process of writing. It's impressive. I mean,
I'm trying to see if anything's missing.
I don't think so. I think we got it. I hope we got it.
You don't have Unparalleled, do you?
I'm crying inside right now.
Okay.
There's a teardrop coming
That's
down
all
my
right.
cheek right now.
That's my worst selling book. So
Got me.
Whatever.
So, so walk us through you produce obviously a ton of content. So walk us through your process of writing.
Yeah, you mean just in terms of like putting the manuscript together?
How do you produce so much? How do you develop
Yeah.
ideas, or how do you come up with ideas? How do you develop those ideas?
I feel like my answer is always disappointing because I always get asked the question like, what's your daily routine like? And I wish that there was, I spend 2 hours every day writing this project, whatever. But it's typically I'm writing a book in the 6 weeks to 2 months before a book is due. And it's a lot of long days, late nights. And I've always operated that way. I've always been a procrastinator. It's not anything I would recommend to anyone, particularly to seminary students. Don't do that. And I tell the guys in my residency, like, I will know if you wrote your paper the day before it was due. So please don't do that. But I have always pushed things. And it's not that I'm not thinking about it. So this is why I don't know if it's helpful, because I think it's a particular about my disposition and the way that I write. I'm writing up here constantly. Just to get a contract, you have an outline. I can't just say, I want to write a book, and someone's like, all right. You have to actually say what it's going to be about, what the chapters will cover, all that sort of thing. So I have a direction. I have an outline. Probably all, in the intervening time, I'm doing research, right? So right now I'm working on a book. I haven't started writing it yet, but I'm doing a lot of reading just to kind of get, in that headspace. It's somewhat about spiritual warfare and temptation. But then what will happen is, so I have an outline already. I'm doing the research, and then I know that deadline's coming, and I have a moment of panic. Panic is good for writers. Kind of, it makes you write, and it'll get you beyond writer's block as well, which I know is something you may want to ask about. Panic is a good antidote for writer's block. And then I just sit down and I start. And usually, what's good about having the outline, really for everything, I'm never sitting down with a blank page going, gosh, I wonder where to go here or what to say. It's usually there's enough that I've been composing in my own imagination, and I have enough of the bones there, I can just start connecting the dots. I need to get from this point to this point, which means I want to flesh out as much as I can in as artful a way as I can, and then I got to make a transition. And it's, I approach almost all writing like that. You have to begin with bones, right? And then you just try to figure out, how do I put meat on this so it looks like a thing at the end. It doesn't look like a blob, right? There's actually a shape to it. There's an arc to it. And it just, my mind works that way. So I wish it was every day I write, 500 words or whatever. And some writers are like that, but I just think writers, like people, are wired differently.
Gotcha. So you come up with you have an idea. Yeah. Then you develop an outline. Yeah. Then you do your research and your reading, and then you kind of put, you flesh out your.
Yeah. Well, and when you're working with a publisher, it's helpful too, because they're informing kind of the direction, and that helps. So, assuming you like the direction that they're pushing you in, so like the book Imperfect Disciple, it began a completely different thing. What I wanted to write was really different, and the publisher didn't like it, and so they said, "Hey, how about this thing?" And I didn't like that. So now we're at loggerheads about what is this book even going to be, and what Imperfect Disciple became was really kind of all right, let's kind of collaborate on how this. We don't like each other's ideas. What are some ideas we may agree on? And then you fight lesser battles along the way that kind of contribute to it. But it's helpful because they're kind of helping you fit a niche. And one of the things that they'll ask you to do if you're doing a book proposal is to say what books are similar to yours and what books, and how is your book, though, different? So you have to think, because they're thinking of it from a sales angle, right? They're business people. So in their mind, they're wanting to sell as many books as possible. So they want to know what are some other titles that are like your book, and then for them to go back and see, do those books do well? Does that kind of thing do well? But then they want to know what is unique to yours that contributes, so it's not just like one of those books or what have you. Or if somebody's looking for a book on X, why would they pick your book instead of, whoever's book? So that helps too, because now you're starting to see kind of the personality of your book. You're starting to see these different directions you could take, and it just helps refine as specific, for you to think specifically about what you're writing. Because if you just go into a project thinking generally, I want to write a book about worship, or I want to, write a book about the gospel, or what have you. Yeah, that's great, but until you kind of narrow down, well, the gospel is applied to what, or how does the gospel help us do this, or whatever it is. It just leads to aimless writing unless you really have this target that you're constantly aiming at with each chapter.
Okay. Do you think, so kind of your process here, does location play a factor at all for you, writing in general? What do you think about
That's a fun question. That's a writer question. Yeah. Like, where do you like to write? Is that what you're asking?
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah,
where do you like to write?
So, like, 2 people here are interested in that, basically. So the writers in the room are interested, yeah. I'm weird because it's hard for me to write in confined spaces. I can do short, like if I'm doing a blog post or whatever, I can do that. But if I'm working on a book or I'm writing something, or like even like a sermon or what have you, I tend to like a big room, and I like for there to be some ambient noise, but not too noisy. So a coffee shop is really good for me because there's just kind of that din of conversation that's going, and it's kind of wide open. So I like public places, for whatever reason. It's hard for me to write in either my home office or my office here if I'm working on a book or what have you. And it's not because of any distraction. It's just there's something about the space I need, and I don't know what that is. It's just a psychological thing. It's not like physically my hands don't work or whatever, but it's just the space somehow. I feel bigger. It feels epic, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of Imperfect Disciples actually written in the Spurgeon Library, which doesn't have a lot of ambient noise, but just the space is so big, and it just felt grand, and it just kind of, inspired me to kind of compose in a really artful way, as opposed to, being surrounded by papers and all sorts of things, yeah.
That's a majestic room to write in.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I set up my home office, it's really cool. I try to make it as cool as I could, and I always end up writing in the dining room because the space is bigger. There's just more room in there, and it just feels like
to the dining room. Man.
I guess I don't know if my wife would like that, but yeah,
probably not.
Yeah, I got this little skull. I could put that on the dining room table. Yeah. Here's a skull for us to have dinner next to. Yeah, that'd be good.
Another question I was going to ask you brought this up earlier about writer's block. So, is writer's block real?
It is real. Yeah, and it is a real thing. Only because if you're trying. Because, it depends on the kind of writing you're doing, but I think in general, yes. Because writing is not the same as like making widgets, right? If you're making widgets, whatever that is, you're building, so right? All I got to do is screw this thing on and screw this thing. There's no mental energy. It can be physically taxing, but it's not occupying your imagination. You're not bringing your whole being really to that necessarily. So I'm not saying that it's, physical work is easy, but writer's block, I think, is certainly a thing because it's in the realm of imagination. But really the only way to get through, so I don't believe when you have writer's block, there are people who you get up and you go take a walk or whatever, take a nap or whatever you're doing. I do think you write through it. And what you do is you just write bad stuff. Yeah,
that was the next question was, if you're struggling with perceived blocks, what do you do to get past that?
I think you just start writing. And it can be total garbage. It's not anything anyone will ever see, but you don't know what could come out of it while you're doing it. But, the best ideas that I have tend to be while I'm writing. I think Stephen King says that writing is like discovering fossils. It's like you're uncovering things. You don't know that they're there. Someone else has said, I write to find out what I think. I don't remember who said that. But it's not me, so don't quote me on Twitter. I don't want to plagiarize somebody. I write to find out what I think. And that's very true. So sometimes I'll be writing a blog post about something because I just know I got to do a blog post today, right? Whether I have block or not, something's got to get up there. And I'll just, let me do a devotional thought on this or whatever it is. But as I'm writing it, it makes me think of something else that really fires me up. So there's something about just getting the muscles going, getting the juices flowing, that can lead you to think about something else. But also reading. So you got blocked, like say, I'm going to read 20 pages of something right now. And inevitably, like if you're a writer, you'll have a thought. Something will begin to kindle as you're reading something. It happens to me a lot when I listen to preaching as well. Someone does an illustration or they're doing a particular exposition on, expositional point, and it just like makes me connect to another dot. And I think, oh, that's something that I might want to preach someday on this little thing. And it's just because it inspired another thing. So, I do think writer's block is a real thing, but really the only antidote is it's not to turn your brain off, but to kind of push through and get to whatever kind of, lights the fuse there.
All right. I got a couple questions I can ask you as we get ready to move towards the Q&A, but I do want to give you guys an opportunity. If you have questions you'd like to ask, I think they're going to put a number up on the screen. You can text in those questions, and I'll get to as many of those as we have time for here. But ask you a couple, I think, softball questions towards the end here. What's out of this stack of books, minus the Unparalleled?
Unparalleled is my favorite. You don't even have it. No, it's
there's
not.
My question. What's the favorite book what's your favorite book that you've written?
My favorite is Gospel Deeps, which I think was my third book, only because it came out exactly as I wanted it to. I'm happy with most of my books, but that was the one where, from beginning to end, I had a particular vision of what I wanted to do, and the publisher was Crossway, and they gave me a lot of leeway to kind of do that, even down to the cover. I've never had the experience where they were like, "What's a cover idea?" And I said, "This is kind of what I'm picturing, but I don't know how to express it." And then what they did, and people either hate the cover or love the cover, and a lot of people hate it, which is sad, but.
Is the one that's got a diamond on it?
Well, here's the thing. I wrote it, so Gospel Deeps is basically every chapter covers a facet of the good news of Jesus. So it's like holding the gospel up like a diamond. There's not more than one gospel, there's just one. But there's all these different lines of seeing the glory of Christ, these different angles. And so every chapter kind of covers a different angle of the gospel: penal substitution, the restoration of the cosmos, just all these things. And at the same time, I was reading Moby Dick, so I had this idea of, and I quote Moby Dick 3 times in the book just because that's what I was you're reading Moby Dick, you're on a whaling ship. I mean, it's boring for 3 months or however long it takes you to read it, and then there's little punctuations of action that happen in the middle. It's oh, there's the whip, now it's gone. Now let's talk about let's talk about wood for 100 pages or whatever it is. But I was immersed in it, and. So for the cover, I was like, you know what? I'm picturing an old vintage book, like an old painting of a ship in the ocean, and I use the metaphor of the gospel like an ocean as well. There's just it's fathoms deep and what have you. And so they did that. They even the way the filter or whatever they used on it has this faded, old timey look, and it's just, to me, it was perfect. And everything that I did in the book is exactly what I wanted to do with it. And so the way it came out, I just thought, from beginning to end, it's exactly how I wanted the book to look. There wasn't a part where I was I wish I had do that differently or what have you. Yeah,
one of my favorite lines of yours is from that book when you're talking about the security of the believer, and you said, "Nobody steals God's stuff," and I don't know why I liked it, but I love that saying. So awesome. Getting quite a few questions here. Some of these are similar, so I'll ask, kind of grouped together. Somebody asked, did you have a goal in mind for when you wanted to be published the first time? And then somebody else asked another question, if you've never been published but would like to be published, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, when I first started writing for publication, or at least for books for publication, I was writing for periodicals and things through college, but I wanted to be published as a novelist. That's how I started. Was trying to write fiction. Nonfiction wasn't even really. Someday, and now it's worked the other way around. It's someday I'll get back to fiction. But originally I was trying to be a novelist, and I kind of set the goal that I wanted to be published by the time I was 30. But I was starting. We moved to Nashville, Tennessee, in 1997, which is when I started writing my first novel. And so I was 22. So I kind of gave myself, roughly 10 years. I gave myself 8 years, basically. And I thought, I'll give it 10 years. Because, I knew it probably would take a while. There wasn't, the self-publishing thing wasn't huge then. There's always been like vanity presses and what have you, but like the Amazon model that we have now, like that didn't exist. It just was really rare. So I kind of had it out of my radar that like I'm not going to be an overnight anything, but you have to start. And I've always wanted to write, and I've always wanted to publish, even since I was a little kid. I just loved published books and wanted to be an author since I was little. So I knew it wasn't like I'm going to give up on the dream. So I gave myself kind of 8 years. And Your Jesus is Too Safe is actually the first book that came out that I published, and that was in 2009. So I don't know if you're doing the math. It took me 12 years from writing my first book to having a book published. So a little over what I wanted. And how old was I? I was, 34. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right when that came out. So, but I'm pleased with what happened. So
good.
Yeah. And how do you get published? Is that what somebody was asking?
Yeah, somebody asked about the process of being published.
Yeah. In some ways, it's easier now if you take the easy route than it is. But if you're trying to go the traditional route and get published, by someone who actually has a presence in the marketplace, Christian or non, it's actually harder, I think, because there's more people trying to write, and there's more noise out there. So there's just more competition, even between self-published and what have you. So the marketplace is more crowded than it ever was. When I was first starting out, again, writing fiction, you didn't necessarily need an agent. You could just send your manuscript or your proposal anyway to different publishers, and there was these things called the Writer's Market Guide, and it would list all the publishers and the kind of books that you were writing, and it had the editors' names and what they wanted to see, all that. And it wasn't easy. I mean, you had to do a lot of work, but it was just all right there. Like, I'm going to send it directly to these publishers and that sort of thing. Now you almost need an agent.
Yeah, somebody just asked that.
There's very few publishers now. Almost every publisher, they're going to get your mail, but if you don't have an agent representing, it's going to go in what they call the slush pile, which is basically a stack of unsolicited manuscripts that end up on some intern's desk. And because there's more people today trying to publish than there's ever been, that pile is bigger than it's ever been. And so what you're counting on is some intern or assistant editor who is probably just kind of looking at your query letter, probably not even your manuscript, just to see, is this worth showing to my boss or what have you. And that's a way you can try to do it. And that's actually how I got my first agent, was some intern at the literary agency who took it home in their stack, my novel, which didn't get published, by the way, but it's what got me an agent, was that way. So I think finding an agent is really the first thing to try to do, and finding a reputable agent. And then if you're not able to do that, then you can start kind of do the solicitation thing. It helps if you know someone, you have a connection, someone who has published who would promise to kind of give you an endorsement or something like that. But it's harder than it's ever been, I think, sadly.
And you may be hinting towards that, but how would you find an agent? The question is, how does someone find an agent?
Yeah, well, I don't know, actually.
Do you find them, or do they find you?
So I found mine using a book. He was in a guide, and then my wife, she worked for Lifeway for 15 years or so, and she was a buyer. So she had connections with all these different publishers, mainly with children's stuff. But one of her buyers told my wife, because the buyer or the seller knew that I was trying to write, told Becky, have Jared reach out to this agent, because I know him and I'll put a word in for him. And he just so happened he was an agent that was in this, it was like Writer's Market Guide to literary agents. So, which you can probably find those things online now. At the time, you just go to the library and look in the reference section to find the guide to publishers or the guide to agents. And you just look through, usually the agents are listed by genre. I write poetry, therefore I'm looking for agents who represent poetry or what have you. And he was in that list of Christian, he represented Christian fiction. But I think you can probably go online now. And so, in fact, if you go, I think, to stevelobby.com, and lobby is spelled Laube, that was my first agent. And I think he has lots of links where there should be like directories where he's actually showing you Christian literary agents that you can reach out to through there.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. Serious question here. Who would win in a rap battle between you and the other Jared Wilson?
In a rap battle?
A rap battle.
Does that guy rap?
Do you rap?
I don't rap.
So
Along with songs on the radio.
yeah,
But
there you go.
I'm not freestyling or
Wouldn't be much of a battle then.
No,
Doesn't
no,
sound
no.
like. Somebody asked a variation of this question: how do you balance? So writing can be a time-consuming process. You mentioned the last 6 weeks to 2 months.
Yeah.
Just kind of being, feeling the pressure and writing for extended periods of time. How do you balance that as a writer? Maybe if you're a pastor, how do you balance, writing, between sermon prep, family, ministry?
Yeah.
You have any recommendations or suggestions for being balanced?
Yeah, I hate the question related to anything. How do I balance? Because usually what people are thinking is like, how do I have equal portion? And that's
not going to happen.
That's not what it is. You have to prioritize. So balance means a lot of something and a little, a lot of something important and a little of something. There's no way to like equalize your portions out. When I was pastoring and trying to write books, a lot of the writing was in the margins of life. So late nights and weekends and times where I didn't have to be engaged with people or working on a sermon or what have you. But it's also one reason, like the question always strikes me odd, because if you're a writer, like you can't not write. And just I've always, in the same way that I'm always reading. Like if I'm sitting down at breakfast and the cereal box is there, like I'm reading like every word on the cereal box. I can't help myself from reading everything that's around me. The shampoo bottle, that sort of thing. So in the same way that I don't have to tell myself to be reading, what I'm around, I'm always writing something. So even like the way I use social media tends to work that way, where it's like turns of phrases or things like, how could I encourage someone with a gospel thought? And it's just, my brain's just always working that way, how to articulate things. So in terms of like how you actually schedule your time to produce, that's one thing. But just, how do I find time to write? Like if you're a writer, you won't be able to help yourself. You'll always be writing in some way, shape, or form. And so that's how it usually worked for me. And I would get away. I had Wednesdays where when I was pastoring, Wednesday was my sermon prep and writing day. And I'd get out of the office, go to a coffee shop in the next town over from early morning, and I would come home probably mid-evening and all day. It's the beginning of my sermon composition in earnest. Usually want an outline by the end of the day. But also if I'm working on a book project, a lot of that is just Wednesdays there at the Coffee Exchange in Rutland, Vermont. And then aside from that, you either get up early or you stay up late. There's no like balance in the workday for things like that. It's a hobby / passion / I got to do it because I can't not do it.
Yeah, that's good. I think this is a good question. How do you get over the difficulty of vulnerability in writing? So do you ever find it hard? You've poured your soul out, or you've written. You ever have insecurity or concern? How's this going to be received? Can I let go of this? When is it ready for other people to see? Yeah. You ever face that tension? I mean, you've written a lot of books, so you may be at the point now where that's not an issue.
Yeah, I think I've always been somewhat forthright. I mean, obviously there are things that you don't tell the world, and so I've never wanted to be immodest about struggles or wounds, or especially if they involve other people. So I remember at the end of Prodigal Church is the place where I have told, shared my testimony in the longest. Like there's been little snippets here and there, but I wanted to tell the story. Well, that involves my wife as well. So, a lot was like sending her the material to say, are you okay with this? Is there anything? And even like, am I remembering things wrong? Like, is this really how it happened? Or how do you remember this? Or getting her to sign off on it. So I think depending on what kind of vulnerability you're talking about, having other people kind of look in and kind of help you see, hey, yeah, that actually would be helpful for other people to read. Or that really actually feels somewhat self-pitying, because that can be one way that we go with people who write transparently. It ends up being more sort of a self-consciousness than self-awareness, or just more like navel-gazing or self-pity. And I think the trend is towards more vulnerable confessional writing, which I think is good. But there are obviously dangers in that, where we end up being overindulgent or saying more than we should, or spending more time talking about how broken we are than we are talking about how restorative Christ is. Yeah, so I mean, there's no benefit in being so confessional that people are just thinking about you and not thinking about Jesus. But I think having some outside accountability or other eyes looking at what you're trying to do to help you, so it doesn't feel like your writing is therapy, I think is probably a good route to take.
All right, I'm going to ask you one last question.
Okay.
Really two questions here. One real question about writing. Somebody wants to know and I feel like sitting down with you, I have to ask this question. Realistic, honest expectations for the Patriots this season.
Realistic, honest expectations. You know what's interesting is we're in this phase. It's the millennial reign, right? So you're not worried about anything. I mean, what else does he have to prove? This is what's crazy. Right? He's 40, Brady's what, 43, 42? 43, 44? It's done. I mean, he could have an awful season and everybody will be cheering and he'll be going home to his supermodel wife with his 6 ring. I mean, it's just, so at one point it's like, it doesn't even matter anymore. But also, the season is following the exact same narrative as the last few seasons, which is they always give up 2 or 3 games in the beginning. Everyone's like, Brady's done. They start writing his obituary on ESPN, and social media is like celebrating over his corpse. And then they come back and smoke the Dolphins, 38-7 or whatever it was. It happens every single season, and you people never figure it out. Patriots fans, they know the storyline. So I know at some point he's going to tank because he's not getting younger.
Right.
I mean, it looks like he is. It's kind of weird.
It is weird.
It's like a Benjamin Button type thing, or Michael Jackson hyperbaric chamber, or so, I don't know what he's doing. Avocado ice cream. He's aging backwards. But no, he's getting older. It's going to take just one solid hit. You know what I mean? If he gets hit, and he'll be done just like anybody else. So I'm realistic about that. But I'm also, he looks good. He went to the Super Bowl. There's no noticeable decline. There's just, I think it's going to be,
There's
he's
not
done.
Peyton Manning where he's still in.
No, right, yeah. Like, what is he doing out there with a broken back trying to throw the football? Yeah, I don't think we'll see that. Yeah.
All right, here's the last question. If you could leave us with one piece of advice for aspiring writers, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh.
And you may have already said it, but you may want to reiterate something. But one piece of advice to leave us with.
Yeah. So on top of all the things, read a lot, write a lot. I think be yourself is probably the best piece of advice that I could give. Certainly, you have writers that you admire or preachers that you admire, or what have you. And you're sort of, you're becoming a pastiche of, all of your influences. But the best writers, like, you read them and you look, that's C.S. Lewis, right? That's Ernest Hemingway. Whatever it is, preachers have their particular thing. I think finding your rhythm, finding your voice, the more that you do it, that's probably the best advice I could give is try to be the best writer that you can be, not the best writer you think will impress people, or the best writer that you admire, but to be yourself.
Great. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. Let's give Jared a hand.